I don't think there's like a word for mental illness in Chinese. So ghosts were used to explain everything. And I think it's a fear that has like manifested itself in my mother and the family.
I heard a story that when you were in school, you took like a career test. And what did it say?
Oh, I was told to be a comedian.
Okay.
A tattoo artist. That was number 2. And the third was a mortician.
A mortician?
Yeah, a mortician. They said I would be really good at it.
Why do you think they thought you'd be a good mortician?
Maybe they thought I'd be good with dead people, or I had no social skills.
Because I could understand the first two, right? Because you're really funny. In the books, you're really funny. So comedian makes sense to me.
Maybe.
Yeah, you have tattoos, so maybe I can understand tattoo artist. Mortician, though. Was there something like dark about you back then? Was there something...
I don't know. They kind of give you like a personality test in terms of like who do you work well with? And they're like, well, you'll work well with dead people. They don't talk back.
Yeah. Who do you work well with? People who can't respond.
Exactly.
People who don't have any. So what did you make of that at the time?
And I was like, well, maybe that could work. They can't complain, right, if you do a bad job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you never pursued it.
No, I became a writer instead.
Probably a good idea. Is there something about the reason that ghosts keep coming up through your work?
Yeah, I just think that, growing up with ghosts, like my family always talked about them. They're always afraid of ghosts, right? And, and the woo-woo is like mental illness. And my mother to this day is always like, oh, you should be aware of this ghost or that ghost. And I'm like, no, it's fine. I'm not going to be, possessed by a ghost. And so I've always thought about ghosts like as around me. So I've always been interested in writing about them. I've never seen one though.
Really?
Never seen one. So I don't know if they exist, but I'm open to it.
Have you heard one?
No, I have not.
So no experience with them?
No experience at all.
Do you believe in them?
Maybe. I mean, my family does, but I think maybe I'm different.
Right.
Yeah.
For people who don't know you as well and people who didn't read the woo-woo, can you give us a little bit of background on like what your life was like growing up?
So my family, they're a traditional Chinese family. They don't believe in ghosts at all. I mean, they don't believe in mental illness at all. They think ghosts cause everything from demonic possession to cancer to illness. And so growing up, it was very much, ghosts do this, ghosts do that. Be afraid of the woo-woo.
And again, for people who haven't read it, like how does that affect you?
It made me afraid, I think, growing up, and not really wanting or knowing about mental illness until, I went to university and they were like, you're really weird, Lindsay. And I'm like, okay, well, why am I weird? And then, we would just have these conversations and creative writing workshops, and people were like, have you, thought about getting therapy? Have you talked to a psychiatrist? And I think that was, when you first leave your family, you start to think about, well, mental illness exists. And so I think that sort of became like a way for me to examine my upbringing. I guess some people would say, it's borderline abusive, it's borderline, insane, but, it was really just like what I knew growing up. And then in 2018, my aunt took the city of Vancouver hostage by trying to jump off a bridge. And that was sort of like the first time I had really thought about, okay, this is mental illness. This is what happens when we have inherited trauma and it manifests itself.
When you started to like look back on that time to write the woo-woo, how did you end up feeling about the way that your family talked about ghosts as sort of a coping mechanism for really talking about mental illness?
I think I started to think about, where they'd come from in terms of, their upbringing, how they had come from Hong Kong and China. And I began to really see them as people. We don't always see eye to eye, but that's how they exist, right? And what they know of the world. To this day, we don't even talk about the woo-woo. We don't talk about the book. I'm sure they've read it or they know about it, but, it's hard, I think, right?
But to make sure I understand, like, you were sort of looking back and going like, well, this is probably not great, the idea that they would talk about ghosts and the woo-woo.
That's true, yeah. I was, I think, very angry at them growing up. And then it's really when you write a memoir, when you're forced to examine, who you are in relation to your family, that's when you start to, I think, forgive people or at least understand who they are.
What was it that you learned about their upbringing that made you come come to that feeling?
I think my mom especially had a really hard childhood growing up. She had, a schizophrenic grandmother. She had, 7 siblings. They grew up with poverty. And then they came to Canada. And they had to learn a new language, right? And they didn't always have access to mental health professionals.
It's easy in that stage to if you aren't aware, to attribute it to something more supernatural coming into the house.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And they're very insular, I think. So for them, it was like the woo-woo was a way to survive it all.
I heard a story that when the woo-woo came out, you took your mom back to Hong Kong. Is that right?
Well, we went to Hong Kong in 2019.
Yeah.
I jokingly say like maybe they were like afraid people would ask them about the book. So we went to, I guess, hide in Hong Kong, escape with Canada Reads. Right? It was my first time back. And, we just ate a lot of food. And I met people that were related to me. And it was a really, I guess, interesting experience to see them and see their villages, which had been like bulldozed. But we never talk about the book. I think they're very afraid of it, or afraid if they tell me something, I'll talk about it or write about it.
I heard a story that when you were in Hong Kong with your family, like you'll have to help me with this, but like you visited like a playground your mother used to play on, where there would be like human bones and stuff like that. Is that right?
Yeah, there was like a graveyard to the school, and there was like these weird graves sticking out. And my mom would say like, "Oh yeah, we'd play with bones when we were children," and then she would just like not say anything. And I'm like, "That's creepy and weird." And I think that's probably what started it all, right? This fear, right? And the way the fear manifests itself in my family.
Help me understand that better. Like that started it all. That's the fear.
I think so, because she'd always talk about like having to walk to school and all the graves and the bones and being afraid all the time, right? And I think not understanding her mother, who had schizophrenia, who'd probably talk to her about ghosts, right? And seeing things that weren't there. And there was like no word for schizophrenia, right? I don't think there's like a word for mental illness in Chinese. So ghosts were used to explain everything. And I think it's a fear that has like manifested itself in my mother and the family.
When you wrote the woo-woo, how many people did you think were going to read it?
Oh gosh, I thought only 5 people would read it, to be honest, including my agent. I thought no one would read it, no one would care. I'd get this nice book to put on my bookshelf, and I would never have to talk about it again, or, I never thought anyone would care, really.
Why did you write it?
Well, I think I really wanted to make sense of who I was and my upbringing, and it just felt like a thing to do. Maybe it was cathartic in that moment, but then at the same time, it really shocked me that so many people could relate to it. 1 out of 5 Canadians have mental illness. We don't talk about mental health enough, especially in Chinese culture. It's still a very tabooed subject.
So when the book blows up and becomes this big thing on Canada Reads, and everybody in the country's reading it, what was that like for you?
I was terrified. I also didn't believe it. I think I was like, this is not happening. It's not real. But I was really surprised by the response. If I'd known so many people would read it, maybe I wouldn't have been that honest.
Why were you terrified?
I think I just didn't know there would be readers. I think a lot of the times I write for myself. It's a very, I guess, private process in many ways. I'm never thinking about audience. I'm never thinking about, who is this reader?
You've experienced a mental illness yourself, right?
I mean, I was diagnosed with a neurological disorder. I have anxiety.
Yeah.
But I've never. I hope I'm not my grandmother.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
But just to say, like you write this book sort of very privately dealing with, your own life and your own family and the family's relationship with mental illness and ghosts and taboo subjects like mental illness. And there would almost be more of a comfort, Lindsay, in the idea that like, no one's ever going to read this, so I can write it.
Mm-hmm, exactly. You just sit down and you're like, it's for myself, right? And I think when my agent was shopping it around, we didn't have much of a response from publishers. People were like, this is too weird, it's too dark. And so I just thought, there's no audience for this book.
Right. And then when do you find out that it has taken off?
I guess it was nominated for the Hillary Weston Prize. And then Canada reads, and then you're like, oh, okay, more than 5 people are going to read it. People are emailing me. They're asking me questions. And all of a sudden, I have, people wanting me to read from my book.
What do? Do you hide away?
I would like to hide away. I would like to just hide in my apartment and pretend it's not there, but it's, not a reality.
I remember when I got this job, everyone was writing me saying, this is like the greatest, Tom. Like, wow, like you've worked and, and like you're going to get to do this job. And I spent 2 straight days in bed because I just couldn't come out. I was so upset. I was so anxious. I was so fucked up by it. Like, so I understand what you mean by that. That like what can seem like really good news to a lot of people can be a really terrifying ordeal. So was that kind of your experience?
Oh yeah, for sure. All I wanted to do was lie in bed and smoke weed. That was all I could manage.
I think that's all I did too.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it kind of numbs your emotional processing.
And of course, you sound ungrateful if you say like, I wish I could hide, but it's a different ordeal, I think.
Did you find a bit of peace with it eventually?
I'm still terrified of talking about my work and doing media promotion.
Oh, gee, I'm sorry.
I'm like terrified, but I'm gonna do it.
You're doing great.
I'm okay.
This is going well.
I'm surviving. I haven't fallen apart yet.
No, you haven't left.
No. I haven't run away in terror.
Yeah, listen. Anytime a guest comes on cue and they don't run out in terror, I consider that a victory.
Okay, good.
I consider that a win. So we're how about this? We'll make things easy on you. Can I get you to read a little bit from one of my favorite stories in the book?
Sure. The Newly Delight is about a grandmother who comes back from the dead to protect her grandchildren from racist schoolyard bullies. I think, having a family member come back from the dead is pretty much a horror story in itself. Like, I would not want my grandmother or my mother to come back.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah. In our living room, Grandmama Wu has yet to become a ghost or zombie. Shithead, she shouts, waving a moldy arm at me. Asshole. A ghost, I feel, wouldn't be able to call her oldest grandkids so many horrendous names. A zombie would probably just devour her grandchildren without parental consent. My little brother Ernie, whose cranium is granching like a GMO watermelon on account of him having too much brain sap, tries to hug her and she lets him. She bends her head, nibbles on Ernie's greasy hair like a bunny, spits out dandruff. Delicious, she announces, and lets out a wet, unholy belch.
Talk to me a little bit more about the story and where this might have come from.
Yeah, I was just thinking about my own grandmother. She passed away during COVID in 2020. She was always this frightening figure for us. She had schizophrenia, and the family always just said, stay away from her. She's frightening. If you show a sign of weakness, you're going to turn out to be like her. And so...
Hold on. If you show a sign of weakness...
Yeah. So they believe that if you cry, a ghost will possess you if you're emotionally weak. So that was something, we grew up thinking about, right? We just blamed her own illness on her. And so I thought about it and I imagined, as a child being scared of this figure. And I thought, what if she came back from the dead? But at the same time, family, even though they scream at you, they still love you. Like Asian culture, like they yell at you all the time. But I'm sure, they would come back from the dead if I needed help.
Yeah. I mean, the first part of the story is the grandmother, I should say, like yelling and being quite obnoxious and telling them off and sort of rejecting who they are and all that. And then once it becomes time to protect them, once these kind of racist bullies come around, she snaps into attention and she protects them. Mm-hmm. So that what you're telling me is that's the symbolic of sort of that dichotomy there between how much we love somebody, even though we might yell at them and flip out at them.
Oh, yeah. The bonds of family, right?
I've never seen ghosts depicted this way either. Like I think I'm so used to ghosts being wispy and like Casper-y.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I just think that, Chinese ghosts, they would be in some kind of form, right? They wouldn't be whispery and caspery. They would be able to, do things, right, and terrorize family members.
What makes you think that?
I'm just thinking about my own family and how forceful they are in my life. I'm sure if they came back, they wouldn't be passive. They would probably be like Grandmama Wu.
The title story too, the Tell Me Pleasant Things About Immortality, that got me too, because as someone who thinks a lot about mortality and thinks a lot about death, I've always just assumed that living forever would probably be the ideal thing to do. But the lead character in the story does get to live for, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's not like an incredibly pleasant thing.
Yeah.
Where did that story come from?
I just thought about, death really. And, would you want to live forever or would you want to be a ghost? And I think it'd be terrible to fall apart, to be one of those zombies and stuck in your own body. And I think, as a culture, we're obsessed with beauty and youth. And for me, that sort of became the inspiration. Especially, I think, in Chinese culture, we're always talking about, how our physical features dictate your future. Like we have a low forehead means you have low IQ, small ears means you're going to have a really lucky life. And so I became obsessed, I think, thinking about, what does this mean? What is our future like? But yeah, I don't know if I would want to be a zombie or a Chinese ghost. I don't know.
Does being so close to illness, be it a neurological condition or, mental health, or like you said, your aunt's, as you put it, taking the city hostage, with an attempt to harm herself. Does that make you think differently about death that might lead to this kind of story?
I guess so. I'm always, thinking about, well, I think schizophrenia only happens, it can affect people who are 45. So I'm going to celebrate when I'm 45 if I don't have schizophrenia. And also thinking my family's always making jokes about death, right? There's always talking about, oh, we're going to pick out our coffins. Do you want to get a gravesite beside us? And I'm like, no, I don't want to spend eternity with you. That's to my mom, right? It's a terrible idea. And so plus, we have ancestor worship in Chinese culture. So we're always burning paper money, paper houses to the dead. So the idea that, the dead, they're very much like us. They're, they have the same wants and needs as us.
Where do you think your dark sense of humor comes from?
I think it's always been something for me to survive. Like Joan Didion, she said we need stories, to tell us, to help us live. So for me, laughing at something has always been a way to get through something horrible. When I was diagnosed with a neurological condition, they told me, you may not be able to read, you may not be able to write. And at that time, I was devastated. And so for me, to look back at it and to see that absurdity in that situation, it was something that could help me get through whatever it was I was going through, or writing, right? Even when I'm thinking, I think I lied about my audience. If I can't make my audience laugh at the darkest parts, then I've lost them.
You think you've lied about your audience?
If I can't make them laugh,
right?
If I need to make a joke for myself as well.
Right. Can you read the dedication?
Sure. For my ancestors who faced terrible and portentous horrors, I've heard the stories about surviving famine and the Japanese invasion of China, and how starving villagers swap children to eat. Thanks for sparing Grandma.
There's an emoji there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a smiley face.
There's the dark sense of humor right there.
Yeah. We were always talking about, at least my family's always saying oh, Grandma survived this, Japanese invasion. So I think I do write a lot about family mythology. And they always talk about how they had to swap children to eat or sell their children. And so I think it's just a natural thing to joke about for me.
Why did you want to dedicate the book to them?
I think the idea of our ancestors being present is something I've been thinking about, especially the idea of immortality and ghosts. Are they around us? Ancestor worship. I don't know. I don't know if they would like this book. Maybe they would.
There was something that came to mind to me when I was reading it, where I thought about maybe if you were raised in a system in which you are not given a tremendous amount of agency, maybe being written as a ghost allows you to have some of the agency that you didn't have in life. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think so. Especially, I think for women of color, marginalized people, you have all this inherited trauma. Leave a country and you carry all this, pain and memories. And as a ghost, you might be free.
Before we go, you mentioned that you don't know how your family feels about these books.
Yeah, we don't talk about it.
You don't talk about it?
We don't talk about it. I had to move back home during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And no one said anything about the woo-woo. No one talked about my writing career. Every time I left the room, they would just talk about themselves. I think they're afraid of me.
Are they afraid that you're going to write about them in a book or something
I
like
think
that?
so, and maybe they're scared I'll talk about them.
How do you feel about that?
At first, I thought it was hurtful, but then I'm like, well, it's freeing. Now I can say whatever I want.
Because they're not going to read it anyway.
I guess not. Or if they read it, they're not going to talk about it.
I will say that for like everything that we've talked about with regards to your family and your ancestors and all the writing you've done about them, the one thing that I really get from, I hope you don't mind me saying this, is a real deep sense of love for them in everything we've talked about. Like there's a deep abiding love I can feel for both your family and your ancestors in this work.
Yeah, it's a very complex relationship, I think. It's not always fun or beautiful, but I think it's there.
Lovely to meet you.
Yeah, thank you.
You're off the hook.
Okay, great.
You got through it.
I survived. Thank you for this.
How do you feel?
I don't know.